The other day, whilst having a good old browse through some of my old videos, watch my own content, I came across something rather odd. You see, in the near 200 odd Terraria weapons I have reviewed, there's one that's just kept coming up, but still after all this time, never got a dedicated video despite its relevance. None other than the Crystal Serpent. For me, this weapon falls under the same umbrella as a bunch of other early Hardmode mage weapons, like the Life Drain and Sky Fracture. So the question is, how does it compare to its close alternatives, and is it worth going for over these options? Before we jump into it though, want to know something absolutely insane? Around 80% of you beautiful people aren't actually subbed to the channel. So if you enjoy these weapon reviews, why not let YouTube know, as it really helps out. Okay then, now let's see how you get this thing. As many of you may or may not know, the Crystal Serpent is in fact obtained via fishing. Now, there are many pros and cons to this. For instance, with a bit of luck, you could theoretically obtain this thing mere seconds after defeating the Wall of Flesh. However, assuming a typical scenario with non-dream fishing RNG, this will not be the case, with a good bit of setup required first. Off the bat, when it comes to your location, you will need to find yourself a healthy sized body of water in your hallowed, which doesn't necessarily need to be the one on your surface and works fine underground. Something to keep in mind with this, however, is that crossing two biomes together may dilute the pool, like this oasis here. Also, if you plan on getting this thing with near to no fishing setup, all I can say is good luck. As with the Crystal Serpent being deemed as extremely rare on the official wiki, you might be here for quite some time. So, by obtaining a bunch of fishing boosting items from completing angler quests, you can drastically increase your fishing power and obtain this thing so much quicker. For the absolute overkill setup, you'll need to acquire a golden fishing rod, full angler set, angler earring, 3 versions of the tackle box because the fishing power does stack, a fishing bobber, the best kind of bait, chum bucket, and of course consume a fishing and sonar potion for good measure. This alone will give you massive fishing power and a pretty good chance at getting it. But we can always increase this even further by fishing in the morning, during heavy rain, with a full moon. This is just kind of excessive at this point. Oh, and don't forget to fish while on the bog for an additional 5% fishing power. And with this all done, or at least some of this done, it shouldn't be long until you get your very own Crystal Serpent. Right, let's see if it was worth it all. As mentioned, the Crystal Serpent does find itself in the same ballpark as many other early hardmode mage weapons, with its DPS being pretty good on single targets, but falling slightly behind this Sky Fracture, which shares a similar functionality. Also, if you were worried about the life drain, don't worry, because on single targets at least, you'll have a far better time using the Crystal Serpent, assuming you can hit all your shots. Speaking of shots, an awesome feature of these Serpent's projectiles is the way they shatter into 3 or 5 smaller sparks upon impact with an enemy or tile, dealing a surprisingly high 80% of its base damage. This of course screams for the multi-target test, and as you can see, does increase its DPS against lines of targets slightly. But I do have to say, this only puts it on par with the aforementioned Sky Fracture. And coming in hot, the Life Drain absolutely knocks both out the water with unmatched early hardmode group performance, dealing over 1000 DPS. So I mean, with this in mind, it's only fair we looked how it did against the real thing. And you know, them splitting projectiles do put in work, especially when enemies are all nicely packed together. I'd say now that, compared to the Sky Fracture, its time to kill on these mummies are all within the margin of error, with no one really coming out on top in terms of reliability. What does leave them for dead once more though, is the Life Drain, utterly vaporizing this low HP group like they're nothing. But we knew that already, and luckily, against a tanky single target, the Crystal Serpent is definitely a viable option, once again performing similar to the Sky Fracture. So, with this in mind, what about bosses? Well, starting with the Queen Slime, apart from the Serpent's lowish projectile velocity, you'll have absolutely no problem taking her out with this thing. The only real thing to keep in mind is, the Meteor Staff exists at the same progression point, and I think is one of the very best pre-mix single target mage weapons in the whole game. And unfortunately, I have to say it doesn't really get much better from here, with all the mech bosses posing quite a large threat for this weapon. You see, this is where definitely more harder hitting mage weapons like the Meteor Staff and Spirit Flame come to play. And don't forget just how amazingly Life Drain can be against Destroyer, basically offering a free kill there. It is a tough one really, because while the Crystal Serpent doesn't necessarily have any bad qualities about it, there are just so many other great options at this point. And yeah, if you just want to use this as your primary hardmode weapon, you can go for it, with having plenty of crowd controlling abilities. But unless you've already got the fishing infrastructure in place to obtain it in a jiffy, I wouldn't say go out your way to obtain it, as that time could be spent on something like the life drain or meteor staff instead. Let me know down below what you think of the Crystal Serpent, and if it's worth the fishing grind. This has been sockrteez, and I'll see you in the next one.